Alright, welcome back to the channel. We discuss all things related to research from an African perspective. In other words, research from a global south. This is the research platform and my name is Professor Angelo Dube. Welcome to yet another episode where we discuss a hotly contested topic called decoloniality or decolonization. We'll be dealing with the why, the what, and the how. Let's begin from the beginning. Let's start with my personal experience. You know, the word decoloniality or decolonization, it first began to gain currency around about the same time as the fees must fall movement. You know, it began being thrown around in conversations, in social circles, in academic circles, in scholarly circles. So everyone was talking about decolonization or decoloniality. It was just like a carefree word being thrown about, everyone demanding this, everyone having an opinion on decoloniality, but nobody was going down to the basics of defining what decoloniality is or what decolonization is. So at the height of the fees must fall protest which occurred in South Africa a few years ago, this word was, doing the rounds, was trending, it was causing confusion. So many of the opponents of decoloniality, they based their arguments on the fact that there is no definition for this thing. Because at the time, as much as it was a sexy word to throw around, nobody had attempted to sort of define it. In fact, the definitions that were there, the attempts to define this term were, they were not necessarily uniform. They were not necessarily talking to one thing, but they're talking to a number of things, all of them concerned with decolonization. So opponents of this movement sort of relied on the lack of a uniform commonly agreed definition for the term in order to allow them to dismiss it as something that was just fanciful, as something that, fees must fall movement was simply riding on the back of to gain popularity or notoriety. There was quite a number of those ideas going around in academic circles. Their main attack was, how can you decolonize that which you cannot define? So as far as they were concerned, until there could be a definition for this word, you could not really make claims or demands on decoloniality. They were right on one thing. They were right on the fact that we lacked a definition of the term. But they were wrong to assume that to make demands about a particular thing, you must first decolonize it. Correction, you must first define it. There was absolutely nothing wrong with making decolonial demands, even if the term itself was not defined at the time. Because decoloniality oozes from within. It comes from within the individual, the sense of yearning for an identity, the sense of yearning for who am I and what is said about me and who says these things about me. We cannot necessarily define those things. Those things come from our lived experiences. So those demands that were made because people were feeling this need, to feature in the global narrative on their life, on their personhood, on their on basically the debates about who they are or what they stand for. So that approach that was doing the rounds back then, when people were saying, define it first and then you can make demands on it, was a very dismissive approach. It was based on the fear of change, people fearing that a new thing was on the horizon and they were not willing or ready to accept it. They were so used to the normal, the old normal, that they didn't want to embrace this new normal that, the demands for decoloniality were calling for. So this fear of change was manifesting itself in this toxic nostalgia with the past. This toxic nostalgia with a past which was created by the colonial powers, because we didn't create this past that we found ourselves living in. It was created by the colonial power. But somehow we have nostalgic attachments to it. We don't want to let go of it. We don't want to challenge it. We don't want to rock the boat. So the colonial powers created this past and they normalized it. Everything about it was normalized. It was passed down from generation to generation. We stand today with people who are asking us to define decoloniality before we can make demands about it. So I recall a conversation between myself and some of my colleagues in some other university I used to work at back in the day. And you know when you are sitting there waiting for a committee of the university to start its work, and people are engaging in small talk over coffee, and usually it doesn't end well because people at that level often just manifest their misunderstandings of certain concepts. And that's what happened in this particular instance. The major question that they were raising, it was around the fees must fall protest, the fact that they were demanding decoloniality or a decolonized curriculum. And the question that these colleagues were posing was, I don't get these students. How do they demand decoloniality? How do they demand that to decolonize the curriculum? How do you decolonize science? How do you decolonize mathematics? Those were the questions that were being discussed. And I remember at the time, as a staff member, I probably didn't have a good understanding of fees must fall at that time. But at the same time, I was appalled and incensed and vexed by this question, because something in me just rose up. Like, are you saying that everything we know in science was received from the colonial power? Are you saying that everything in mathematics came from the north? It came from Europe? Because that was the center of their question. But they were bold enough to ask it, and they believed in it. And quite a number of people agreed within that circle that this is nonsense. You cannot decolonize mathematics. Because to them, decoloniality meant accepting that Africans contributed to these knowledges, to contributed to these subjects, or to the generation knowledge around those subjects. And in their heads, that could not be, because in their heads, Africa was a receiver and not a creator of knowledge. So did I tackle it head on? No. I simply walked away, because that was my mindset at the time. I couldn't take, the sentiment that was coming from that discussion. So I moved away. I was pissed off. I moved away. I didn't have an answer, because I didn't know the definition of decoloniality, and I couldn't frame my argument for decoloniality at the time. So the simple thing I did was just walk away. But from that time onwards, I then began to look into decoloniality, what it is, what it could be, or what it means for me, and the subject that I was responsible for in the various institutions I've worked at. So I could also pick that their question was a rhetorical question. It was more of a question that had an answer already, and the answer was no, you cannot decolonize this subject, because you just can't, because that's how they felt. So it wasn't a question that required an answer, really. It was an expression of their belief on the inferiority of African knowledge systems. So it comes from the perverse notion that the fields of science and the fields of mathematics did not originate from Africa. They were received. It comes from the misguided notion that we should be grateful for coloniality. We should be grateful for Christianization, because through these two methods we got the knowledge that had made Europe advanced, in quotation marks. But I'll deal with that later on. I'm just painting a picture of where I was with decoloniality some 5 years, 6 years ago, versus where I am today with the subject of decoloniality. In other words, these people were assuming that we were civilized by Europe, and therefore we must be grateful for being given knowledge on science and being given knowledge on mathematics. It overlooks a number of things, a number of historical and anthropological evidence from the continent that points to the fact that we did create knowledge in mathematics, we did create knowledge in science, we did create knowledge in law way before the European tribes and clans stopped fighting each other. But because this Eurocentric view has been sent forth, it has been perpetrated, it has been repeated over time, it has assumed a form of a fundamental truth. So what exactly is decoloniality? I do not necessarily have a straight answer. I simply present here what I believe are the elements or components of decoloniality. It may mean something else for someone else. For the European, it may mean something totally different. It may actually appear as, an attempt by an African to claim a space he doesn't necessarily rightfully own, because they have sort of owned that space for so long. And when we rise and claim that space, it surely will cause discomfort to them. But for us as Africans, it's an act of standing up and claiming our space, creating knowledge from a global South perspective, creating knowledge from an African perspective, the African saying things about the African and writing things for other Africans about African life experiences. Decoloniality must be approached from that particular angle. So when we're dealing with the what in decoloniality, we are basically not trying to put or to profile a definition that will be universally accepted. No, people may actually disagree with our approach to decoloniality. But we need to first acknowledge there are multiple definitions or understandings of decoloniality. But if you look closely, you will see the commonalities between the various positions taken by various scholars on the subject of decoloniality. I can simply put it as tackling Eurocentrism head on, grabbing the bull by its horns, the bull of Eurocentrism, and saying, listen, come here, I'm grabbing you by the horns and I'm redirecting you now. You're no longer in charge. So decoloniality is basically tackling Eurocentrism head on, not with emotions. We're not going to stand here and spew emotions, show your anger, show your the fact that you're pissed off at Eurocentrism. No, that's not what we're talking about here. When they told us that these knowledges began from Europe, they were not angry. They had no emotion attached to it. They simply told it to us and they repeated it again and again and again until it seemed normal. So we cannot necessarily fight Eurocentrism by being emotional. That's childish. That's so preschool. We need to tackle them head on with hard evidence and facts, because we have plenty of these. But African researchers need to unearth these facts, talk to them, analyze them, and present them so that the common man or woman on the street can read and understand the arguments that we make as African scholars on decoloniality and the debunking of Eurocentric myths and Eurocentric claims. So Eurocentrism has a tendency, to make an empty claim. Mark this, an empty claim. And then repeat that empty claim over time, over a few hundred years. Repeat it again and again and again and again until its proponents and their disciples bona fide believe that claim to be a fundamental truth, an immutable truth. That's why we're where we are at today, because certain empty claims have been made and repeated, written from book to book to book to book, until they appear as normal. Euronormativity. It appears normal from a European perspective. It even appears normal to the disciples of those Eurocentric authors. So some of these disciples that I'm talking about will also be African. They will look like me. They will have brown skin like me. And they will repeat this. And because they come from someone who looks like you will accept them as true. Eurocentrism breeds in that environment. So the African, the colonized, will regurgitate these so-called Eurocentric truths based on an empty claim made 400 years ago by a Eurocentric white male author, who is called the so-called founding father of any discipline. This will be taught again and again and again and again in schools, first by Europeans, who will then train Africans to continue the curriculum, and those Africans will repeat that again and again and again. At some point, nobody will question it. We are where we are today, 400 years later, 500 years later, accepting truths that really erase us from the global South. It erases us from the history. It erases us from any form of recorded development of any subject. It erases us completely. We do not feature. And we've accepted it as true. So for me, Eurocentrism is destabilizing the interpretation of the world from a European perspective. You dismantle that European perspective. It's about uprooting Eurocentric views and ideals everywhere and replacing them with proper, well-founded views, not these empty claims that have been there. Decoloniality is about having multiple perspectives, multiple peoples, and humanizing everyone instead of dehumanizing them. Humanizing everyone instead of having absolute truths, so-called absolute truths. Absolute truths that are produced by the Eurocentric white male, because that has been the leader of Eurocentric thought. And over years, their thought process has been imposed on the global south and regurgitated until it was believed to be true. So the so-called founding fathers of every discipline, it's about dismantling their thought, pointing out their iniquities, pointing out their attempts to erase the African footprint on the development of all those subject areas. And have you asked yourself why there are no founding mothers and only founding fathers? It's a Eurocentric white male perspective. It will always be founding fathers of any field. They don't even want to recognize that there were at some point founding mothers. We still have problems with those because they're also Eurocentric. But at least if they were to acknowledge that they were founding mothers as well, we'd forgive them a little bit, but we still criticize their approach because it will still be Eurocentric and unacceptable to the extent that it erases experiences and historical facts from the global south. So decoloniality is about questioning knowledge generation and valuing the methods of knowledge generation by Africans and by the global south as well. It's also about holding those methods of knowledge generation from the global south and holding them or regarding them as valuable, as contributing to knowledge, and not regarding them as inferior to Eurocentric views. It's about questioning the tools that we are given or were given for our self-expression. Are those tools useful for us? Can we dump them? Can we adopt new tools for expressing ourselves in order to create a self-expression that is meaningful for our growth as a people from the global south? Those are the questions that are at the base of decoloniality. It's about challenging Euronormativity and turning it on its head. It's about reversing, dehumanizing, and othering of other people. Because when Eurocentrism erases us from, the footprint of knowledge generation, it is dehumanizing. It is saying only these humans who are regarded as humans proper from the global north created this knowledge. And out of their benevolence, they then colonized you and gave you this knowledge. Out of their benevolence, they then Christianized you, civilized you, and gave you this knowledge for your own good. And you must be grateful, eternally grateful to the European slave owner who humanized you by giving you this knowledge. Other than that, you were an other. You were not a human being. Unfortunately, we continue, even if they want to believe that they humanized, civilized, Christianized, colonized, and made our lives better, they still want to other us in their writings, because their writings continue to regard us as inferior and our tools for generating knowledge as inferior or non-existent. Decoloniality is about challenging that head on. So it's about dismantling cultural and structural colonial powers and creating your own futures through embracing your own self-determination, understanding who you are, what you stand for, understanding the power within, understanding that before the European imposed Christianity on you, before the European imposed colonization on you, before the European regarded you as not civilized, you were creating knowledge in Africa. You were treating diseases in Africa using science. You had laws in Africa regulating society. You had laws in Africa regulating inter-kingdom, inter-empire relations. You had international relations on the continent way before Europeans stopped fighting each other at Westphalia. So that is what decoloniality is about. Understanding who you are, understanding where you stand now and how you got there. The knowledge you are busy spewing out today is not knowledge that you created. It's knowledge that was given to you. The tools of self-expression were given to you in order to define and confine you to a particular space. Once you understand that and you move outside the mold of the Eurocentric view, once you understand that there's a need to tackle Euronormativity, you will step aside the mold they've created for you and ask yourself, before they stopped fighting each other at Westphalia, what were we doing on the continent? And you will realize that mathematics was being taught here. Medicine was being taught here. Law was being taught here. International relations were being taught here. All these fields that they claim began in Europe and were given to us through Christianization and through civilization. All of them were being practiced here way before they arrived. But what are the barriers to us pushing this decolonial project forward? It's quite a lot. I'll begin from the beginning. We've been fighting about the definition for so long, but people are slowly moving away from the idea of attempting to define this and simply understanding that this is a call to self-liberation. This is a call to mental freedom, to abandon mental slavery and embrace Africanity. To say to the Eurocentric opinion shapers, you cannot do this. You cannot define and confine us. We know who we are. We know where we came from. The portions of history that you erased, we will revive them. We'll bring them back. We'll teach them in our schools. We'll disseminate them. Quite a number of our people will understand who they are and where they came from. And Africa will rise again. So the definition problem as a barrier, we are slowly overcoming that by understanding that we don't all have to define. You see, this Eurocentric view that a concept can only have one definition, universally accepted but generated from Europe, is flawed. We are now at a stage where we are embracing multiple definitions for the same concept, so long as it takes the decolonial project forward, so long as it fosters common understanding of the same concept that we're all trying to debunk. We are way beyond, trying to define decoloniality or fighting about its definition. But the second barrier has been the language used in decoloniality. You hear heavy terms or terms that are too big being thrown about. Terms that will only obfuscate those who hear the message rather than enhance their understanding. Terms that indicate a tendency to want to be lofty and to be elevated and lifted up and in your thoughts, that people will think you are knowledgeable, you are educated, which in itself is a Eurocentric norm that was passed down to us. The idea to want to use big terms when we should just be speaking ordinary language, so that the common man and woman at the taxi rank can understand our message. That has also killed decoloniality, epistemology, pedagogical approaches. I'm not saying it's wrong to use those words, but I'm saying sometimes you need to simplify things so that those who are not yet adherents of what you're proposing can have a buy-in and begin to follow what you're saying. So as long as we are spewing these high terms, these big esoteric terms, we will exclude people. We are doing nothing better than the Eurocentric writer. We are doing nothing better than the colonial European person who was sent here to instill these notions in us. We are othering other people. We are excluding them. And yet we are trying to move Africa forward. We're trying to move the global south forward. So terminology has been a huge barrier to the movement, to Africanize, to decolonize, to debunk Eurocentrism, to tackle Euronormativity head on and turn it up on its head. Those are some of the barriers that we're facing. Let's move on to the why. Why are we trying to decolonize? Because a people who cannot define themselves will naturally amount to nothing. If you allow someone to define you, they will confine you. They determine the parameters. You can only develop up to here. Beyond that you can't, because I have defined you and therefore I've confined you. I've told you who you are. The essence of you was defined by me. So long as we're defined by a Eurocentric worldview, we will forever be operating within the parameters set for us by some European white male in the 1600s. So this external definition of a people has happened in Africa for over hundreds of years, for over 400 years, for over 500 years, and we've allowed it. We've been defined by Eurocentric standards, and all these have had a tendency to confine us as a people. It confines us to a people without a culture, a people without sophistication, a people without a history, a people who, until we're colonized, had no legal frameworks. Prior to the imperial subjugation that we suffered, we really didn't know what diplomacy was. We really didn't know what international law was. We didn't know what science was. We didn't know what, treating brain tumors was. It's all, balderdash. But it's been repeated so much for over 500 years that it appears normal. Normativity. It is settled. People are not willing to challenge it. People are not willing to be seen as the sore thumb that's standing out, and going against, a universally accepted Eurocentric world perspective. But how? How do we begin to decolonize? That's the question you may ask. We need to embrace multidisciplinary approach to research. You cannot sit there and simply research on tuberculosis without going into other fields. You cannot sit there and research on economics and not go into other fields. You cannot sit there and research on family law, on international law, on customary law without going into other fields. You need to be interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary, transdisciplinary in your approach to research. The knowledge we create, the knowledge we generate must benefit from works that were done by anthropologists, works that were done by sociologists, work that was done by historians. And be careful, because some of these historians were writing from a Eurocentric view. They are the ones who gave credence to all these Eurocentric claims. And you need to find a way to move away from that nonsense. And it does not happen until you purpose that in your writings, in your knowledge creation, as an African scholar, you are going to peruse the written texts way beyond what appears in front of you. So you must frame your arguments and your essays in light of other disciplines as well, in order to enrich the text that you produce at the end. Don't just be a black letter lawyer writing to us solely on Section 25 of the Constitution and nothing else. You know nothing about outside the scope of Section 25. You're actually an ignoramus. That's nonsense. That's what has killed this continent. Where you find people being experts on Section 25. Like how? How do you even live with yourself? Infuse other knowledge systems, infuse other forms of knowledge from other fields into your understanding of Section 25 of the Constitution. Don't just be, an expert on Section 25 and you know nothing else outside that. You're not doing this continent a service. In fact, you're doing it a disservice. Because we are regurgitating the Eurocentric approach to knowledge generation. It is unacceptable. Now, let me close by taking the example of international law, a subject I've been dealing with for quite a number of years. Look, we were taught, and these teachings persist to this day, even the books that are still prescribed for the students that we teach still carry that Eurocentric worldview. They will tell you boldly and without flinching that international law began in Europe in 1648, at the time when the tribes and clans of Europe stopped fighting and killing each other, and they came together and said, we need to be civilized. Let's sign a treaty. Let's call these treaties the Peace of Westphalia. And because of these treaties, we shall recognize that we are all sovereign and we're equal. We're now states. And we'll now interact with each other as equal sovereigns, as states. We'll have rights and obligations. We cannot just attack each other without regulation. And because of that, the Eurocentric writer will claim that's how international law was born. 1648. A few years after that, because of the benevolence of this Eurocentric person, they took this thing they call international law, went into Africa to civilize the Africans. Through Christianization and through colonization, for the good of the African, this international law born in Europe in 1648 was then given to the African to live by. And only then did the African begin his journey towards civilization. This is taught in the books. The so-called founding fathers, Hugo Grotius, Gentili, All of them. They write about this nonsense. And it is regurgitated today again and again and again because the so-called founding fathers, white males sitting in Europe, said these things. So they must be true. Normativity. Decoloniality is about saying, wait. Your dead ancestor was wrong. He remains wrong to this day. And I will show you why. I'll give you the examples. That's what decoloniality is about. So, the foundation of international law is portrayed from that angle, that when the tribes of Europe stopped fighting each other and killing each other, and they signed those treaties, boom, it was born, and we received it because we were colonized, we were Christianized, we must be grateful. In other words, minus colonization, Africa had no real idea of what law is, or what international law is, or what international relations is. To this day, this is taught. To this day. You read Malcolm Shaw, a leading scholar, you'll find this. It's there. It's unacceptable. It's not true. But we need a lot of voices from the South to actually oppose that. So that's how we were trained back in the day doing our LLB degrees. That's how we trained our students. Until a few years when we said, man, this is wrong. This cannot be. Let's dig deeper. Let's ask questions outside the mold. This cannot be, definitely cannot be. Something is not adding up here. And that's when we started. We started questioning these things. We started generating new knowledge on African systems prior to the colonialists setting foot in Africa. We started questioning our entire erasure from international law, our entire erasure as a continent from the generation of knowledge from all these other fields I've mentioned before. And it just didn't seem right because we had developed knowledge, we had created knowledge, but we had been erased from the history books. None of these writers will acknowledge that we produced so much for this world. So once you realize as an African scholar or researcher that you've been erased, that's when you take it up as your quest to correct this misnomer, to correct this injustice, to turn Euronormativity on its head, to say to the so-called founding fathers of international law, the so-called founding fathers of gynecology, the so-called founding fathers of radiology, the so-called founding fathers of economics, the so-called founding fathers of any field you can think of. Just do your research outside your field. Multidisciplinary, transdisciplinary, interdisciplinary. Go into anthropology, go into history. Go into other forms of knowledge that are not, highly placed within the Eurocentric ladder of knowledge. You will find that you've been lied to. You will find that you will now start to infuse African ideas, African history, African anthropological findings, Africanized approaches to the concepts that you have for so long believed were developed by a white male from Europe. I hope that was enlightening. I know I talked a lot in that episode, but it had to be said. It had just had to be said. I will in the future be discussing an article that I published with a junior colleague looking at Africa's contribution to international law. I'll take you through how that article was born, how it developed, how the entire journey was, to prepare that article and publish it in a European journal, a leading European journal on international law, to have it reviewed and critiqued by a Eurocentric reader, a reader who sits in the global north, who has had the benefit of Eurocentric views on international law for so long, and they are now confronted with views from a global south, how that whole experience turned out. I will discuss this in the future. Article is in print now and it will be out soon, and I am sure that other African scholars who are into decoloniality will benefit from my experience in preparing that particular manuscript for publication in that leading European journal. Look, we are looking forward to your criticisms, to your suggestions, to your encouragement, to your whatever it is. That just engage with us, in the comments below on social media. We appreciate that. We welcome it as long as we remain collegial and respectful, as long as we understand that we are all intellectual equals, and that is why all our opinions matter. We will take those into account. Please continue to share this in your platforms. Copy the link and paste it in your social media platforms. Encourage others to sort of click like and subscribe, because the more you click like, the more our videos can become visible and be of use to other Africans and to other global South citizens around the globe. Our handles appear below. You will see them there. You can follow us on social media, and if there are any other topics you want us to tackle, we'll tackle them. If you are a researcher in an African institution, we urge you to share this with your students, with your scholars, with your researchers, with the students that you supervise, those who are doing their master's research, those who are doing their PhD research. We urge you to share this with them, because we believe this resource can shape Africa. It can change Africa for the better. It can shift mindsets. It can make Africa great again. As we say on this platform, Maibuye I Africa, and Africa will only rise the moment we all do our part, the moment we pay it forward, the moment we all realize that as Africans we are responsible for bringing back the former glory of this continent. Until next time, Professor Angelo Dube signing out and saying cheers.